So today we're taking a look at the 20mm from Viltrox and pairing it against the 11mm from Sony. Now there's a few differences between these lenses, not to mention the price. I mean, the Sony 11mm is around $450. Sometimes you can get it on discount, on sale. It's also made for crop sensor cameras and it's an f1.8. And the autofocus is a little bit better, where the Viltrox lens is incredibly cheap and works incredibly well for the price. It's sitting around 168 bucks. It is an f2.8 lens, but it is meant for full frame cameras. Now, both of these lenses are incredibly light, and one of the things I want to test them out on is the Sony A7 IV, because the A7 IV, it's a 33 megapixel full frame camera, but in its crop sensor mode, it's still higher resolution than 4K, so you're still getting a nice downscaled image. So we're going to test out the 11mm against the 20mm in the crop mode on the 11mm and the full frame mode on the 20mm. They're both incredibly light lenses, so they fill a lot of the same purposes, especially using them on a camera like the A7 IV. Now, the A7 IV made a lot of sense to do this video over using something like an FX30 because I can switch between full frame and crop sensor. We're putting these both on the FX30. We're going to be stuck in the crop mode. Now, the 20mm is, of course, 20mm in full frame. The 11mm is going to be close to around 16mm as a full frame equivalent. So this is going to be a little bit wider. The autofocus is going to be a little bit better. But again, with the price difference and the fact that this lens covers full frame and it's a lot cheaper, there's going to be some interesting things to find out. So let's take a look at some of the footage.
So this is the Sony 11mm f1.8 made for crop sensor cameras on the Sony A7 IV. Now we're filming at f1.8 so we can film wide open, see what the image looks like. We are in crop sensor mode on the Sony A7 IV. We're also cranked down on the shutter speed. Now, even though I have an ND filter for this lens, I don't have an ND filter for the Viltrox 20mm S. It's a 52mm thread, not a 55mm thread. So I figured the way to make it the most fair test is to just crank the shutter speed down, because I also want to make sure we're at ISO 800 and have the most dynamic range out of this camera. As you can see, it's pretty wide. It's going to be a little bit wider than using the 20mm on full frame mode. And then of course the autofocus is pretty incredible. Now, I guess that was a little too close. We got that, then we got this, then we got that, then we got this. So the one thing that the Sony lens is going to definitely be better at, even though it's a crop sensor lens, is the autofocus. The performance is just stellar, even at 11mm. Now, I want to show you a few things with this lens. I want to show you what it looks like in full frame mode. I also want to show what it looks like when using stabilization for vlogging. Let's take a look at the full frame mode. Now here is using the 11mm in the full frame mode. As you can see, heavy vignetting here, around the corner, so it's not really usable, but what I'm guessing is it's going to be a lot more usable when you turn image stabilization on in the camera, especially if you're trying to vlog with it, than the 20mm is. So let's take a look at that too. Now here's the 11mm with the standard crop, so it's just image stabilization on the camera without actually cropping it a little bit more for active. Now let's take a look at active. Now here's a look at active image stabilization. Now for the most part, you don't really have as much vignetting on the corners. Now what you do notice is there is a lot of distortion. I mean, look at this building right here in this corner right there. It's not really meant to be used in this mode, but let's take it off the camera for a second, or the tripod. As you can see, it is super smooth. Now, the second I start moving around, you do start seeing the vignetting in the corners. So it's definitely not perfect, but you can, if you're selective in how you move around, use the 11mm in the full frame mode with active stabilization on. And that's been a little hack that a lot of Sony ZV1 users have been using, and I'm sure a lot of the A7C II users are gonna be using as well when they wanna use the APS-C mode. But like I said, you can see when you move, when I move like this, you see the vignetting in the corners. Well, there we go. So APS-C mode is definitely going to be the best way to get the best image quality out of the 11mm on the Sony A7 IV. So here we are on the 20mm f2.8. Now, as you see, we're a little bit more cropped in. There's also a little bit less distortion. I mean, this is a 20mm lens versus an 11mm lens, not counting for crop factor. So the distortion is going to be a lot less in this lens. We're also at f2.8, so there's not quite as blurry of a background, but we're also a little bit more zoomed in, so that's going to change a little bit as well. Now this is using the full frame mode, the full sensor. So the other mode, when you didn't see any vignetting, that was using a crop sensor. So the equivalent in full frame using that 11mm in crop sensor mode was around 16mm. So yes, it still was a little bit wider than the 20mm, but that was using the crop mode. So this is using the full sensor, which means if you're trying to use it in low light, you're obviously going to get better ISO performance out of the full sensor mode. Now let's talk about autofocus. The autofocus is okay on this lens. As you see, it works. It's just a little bit slower than the 11mm. However, this is a third-party lens that is a fraction of the price of the Sony 11mm. The Sony 11mm is around $450, where this lens is around $168 on Amazon. So you have a huge difference in price. This is also a full-frame lens, even though it's 2.8, where the Sony 11mm is a crop sensor only lens. So you are getting a huge bang for your buck with Viltrox's 20mm. Now, when you start doing things like active stabilization, that's obviously going to make a difference. Let's check that out right now. Now I'm stepping a little bit further back right here because this is with active stabilization on. And as you can tell, you are cropped in even more. Now I'm going to take the camera off the tripod. And as you can see, as I'm moving around, yes, you could technically vlog with this, but you are going to be much closer to my body, which means the 11mm probably still wins for the handheld vlogging if you're not going to be using a tripod or any kind of selfie stick, but you can definitely use this for vlogging in select cases.
So this is the 20mm on the DJI RS3 Mini and the Sony A7 IV. Now we are not using any type of internal stabilization. It is turned completely off, and this is to get the widest field of view. So we are going down here, we are walking over here, and we are trying just to see with the gimbal how this compares in full frame mode compared to the 16mm in the crop sensor mode. Now it's definitely wide enough, and so as you can see right here, I could totally vlog with this if it's on the gimbal. Now vlogging with a gimbal isn't the normal thing to do, and I get it because there's a lot of setup involved, but people like me, it's definitely an easy way to do it. You definitely get a lot smoother footage. So I wanted to test it out right here and just see how it looks with the 20mm. So now we're shooting with the 16mm f1.8 on the crop mode of the A7 IV. Now, as you can see, it's definitely a little bit wider of a field of view on this. And that's because this is an 11mm lens on crop sensor versus a 20mm lens on full frame. But they're very similar in weight. When I went to go balance the gimbal, it wasn't really a huge difference, but you also get an f1.8 at crop versus an f2.8 at full frame. So the other question remains, does this make a little bit more sense for vlogging? Now I definitely don't have to hold the camera as far away to get a wider field of view. And right now it looks slightly wider. This is about as far as I was holding the camera out before. So as you can see, it's a lot wider than the 20mm. Now the autofocus, like I said before, does work a little bit better, but it's not full frame. Now we have to ask the question, does it make more sense to get the 20mm at $168, or do you want to spend more money and get a crop sensor lens like the 11mm and use it with your crop bodies? I think if you have other crop bodies, it probably makes sense to get the 11mm over the 20mm just because it's a little bit more versatile. But if you're only using full frame cameras, I think the 20mm is probably making the most sense right now, unless for whatever reason you need super critical autofocus. Out of all the APS-C lenses, I think the 11mm definitely has the best value, just because its image quality is really great. Even though, yes, it is a little bit distorted, you can just get a lot out of it. The only thing that's unfortunate is there is no version of this for the actual full frame cameras. So really, only cameras like the Sony A7 IV, the A7 R5, cameras that have a super high megapixel count can take advantage of shooting with lenses like this in their APS-C mode. After seeing the footage, both lenses don't obviously look exactly the same. They have a little bit of a different distortion in the corners. The 20mm is definitely less distorted than the 11mm. I mean, makes sense. It's definitely not as wide, but at the same time, the 11mm totally has the 20mm beat on autofocus. It's a lot quicker, a lot snappier. It's got also little things like it's got the little custom button right here on the side. It's also got an AF/MF switch, which there are no buttons on the 20mm. But again, look at the price difference. Now, if you're just looking to get one of these lenses and you're in the full frame market, look at the 20mm. The quality is not quite as good as the 11mm. I think for the price and what you get, it's really worth it. If you're shooting with other crop sensor cameras, kind of like I do where I have some FX30s, then the 11mm makes a lot of sense because you can use this on the FX30s. You can also use it on cameras like the A7 IV. But if you're shooting on mostly full frame and a lot of your cameras may be something like an A7S III or an FX3 or an FX6, although I don't know if you're shooting on an FX6 if you'd necessarily want this. At the same time, I think this would make more sense on those full frame cameras since you're not having as high of a resolution. You can't really crop in as much to shoot with the 11mm, but it is a really solid lens. And it's interesting how well these two lenses can really compete against each other when they're in vastly different price categories. And not to mention, the Viltrox is a third party made by Viltrox for Sony, and this is a Sony-made 11mm, so it's a first-party lens. Now, if you have any questions about either one of these lenses, make sure to ask in the comments below. I also do have a full review coming up with the 20mm, so make sure to stay tuned for that, and make sure you ask any questions if you have them, and I'll feature them in that video as well. If you got knowledge and value out of today's video, please make sure to hit that like, subscribe, and notification bell to keep up to date with the latest videos on the channel. And until next time, my name's Geoff Fagien. Thank you for joining me as always, and I will catch you in the next video.